Jump to the following timestamp if you want to skip straight to the video. Hey guys, so Sormon is officially 10 years old. It feels like an eternity ago when I decided to upload my Year 11 geography project onto YouTube, and since then I've released over 100 videos, and that's not including the 60 plus videos I've uploaded on my other channel, Xenosanctum. Now as we hit my channel's 10 year anniversary on the platform, I want to celebrate this occasion by looking back on the video which kicked off this channel with the election of 1901. While I obviously have videos going back further than the 1901 election, the recap of my nation's first election was truly where the modern Sormon was born, with it kickstarting the political history/geography nature that this channel was now known for. Despite it being such a key video in my catalogue, it has not aged the best with its extremely crusty audio and footage. Thus, with my superior microphone and editing skills, let's go back over 120 years to the very first federal Australian election with the election of 1901. Now a reminder before we begin that this video is brought to you by my lovely patrons Thomas Johnson, James Rapp, Mike Ran, Cameron Strauss, Tom Smarty, ARW, Edward Pierre, Jezza, Willow, Darathinian, Echolocation, Sloan, and newcomers Cody Jones and Quinton Walker. For as little as $3 Australian a month, you can get your name shouted out at the start of every Sormon video as well as access to bonus behind the scenes content, link in the description below. By the end of the 19th century, the multiple British colonies of Australasia had grown into a rather successful regions of the British Empire, with the colonies of Australasia becoming more self-sustaining with ever-increasing numbers of native-born residents. Nationalism began to grow in the colonies, and they began to demand for an Australian state. In 1867, the colonies of Canada were granted a Dominion status, in which the colonies would now answer to a local federal government in Ottawa instead of the British government in London. Upon seeing the establishment of a federal Canadian government, Australians immediately began demanding for a federal government to be established in Australia too, and with it the federation movement began to get momentum. While the United Kingdom was initially reluctant to grant Dominion status to Australia, the ever-growing power of other nations in the Pacific made the British nervous. Thus a federal state sounded like a great idea to better push for British interests in the region. In 1885, the Federal Council of Australasia was established to develop the structure of a unified nation in the region. Despite the strong push for a unified state, issues began to be raised between the colonies as to how power should be divided up in this new federal state, with the smaller colonies of Tasmania and New Zealand being concerned about joining a nation dominated by New South Wales and Victoria. Meanwhile, others worried about tariffs as well as concerns that the more successful states would have to financially support the poorer states. This would eventually see the colonies of New Zealand and Fiji back out of the negotiations, leaving just the 5 colonies of mainland Australia alongside Tasmania to push forward with federation. Eventually, after decades of debates between the states and their representatives, an agreement of the nature of a federalised Australian state was made following 2 referendums conducted across the colonies. By the start of the 20th century, the Constitution had been ratified, and the nation of Australia was born on the 1st of January 1901, and with the nation established, Australia was now set to host its first ever federal election. Despite Australia forming on the 1st of January 1901, the election was not set until late March. Thus to govern Australia, an interim government was needed. The process of selecting this interim government will fall to the Governor-General, John Hope, Earl of Hopetoun. Hopetoun was a British aristocrat who had previously served as Governor of Victoria, where he had developed good relations with several Federalists. Thus, when calls went out for the position of an Australian Governor-General, Hopetoun was quick to submit his name to Queen Victoria, who approved it. Despite getting the role relatively easily, Hopetoun would soon find the role of Governor-General very challenging due to the interstate rivalries between the soon-to-be united colonies. If that wasn't bad enough, Hopetoun had also picked up typhoid fever on his way to Australia. The result of this left Hopetoun in a pretty poor state of mind, which would cause a lot of issues when it came to choosing an interim government. Throughout the multiple meetings of the Federal Council of Australasia, New South Wales Federalist Edmund Barton had rose to prominence as the ideal candidate to lead the interim government as Prime Minister, due to his strong relationship with Federalists from other states like Alfred Deakin. However, Hopetoun would not approach Barton to be Prime Minister, instead requesting New South Wales Premier William Lyne take on the role instead. The reason for this move came down to protocol. In Canada, Premier John A. Macdonald of Ontario had, as the leader of the most populous state, taken on the role as first Prime Minister. Despite the move making sense from a political perspective, the move was totally illogical from a situational perspective. Unlike Barton, Lyne was an opponent of federalisation, thus to have someone who opposed Australia as a concept now lead Australia did not go down well with Deakin and other Federalists who told Hopetoun that they would not serve under a government led by Lyne. Realising his mistake, Hopetoun would renounce his intention to give Lyne the Prime Ministership and would instead give it to the obvious choice of Barton. With what later came to be known as the Hopetoun blunder now over, Barton would now assemble a cabinet with only a week to go before Australia was set to federate. Luckily, Barton's close connections with other federalists would allow him to assemble a small 11-man government with only 2 days to spare before federation. With the government established, Barton would turn his attention towards the first election set to occur on the 29th and 30th of March. For this election there would be 65 lower house electorates, 63 of which were single-member electorates. Meanwhile, due to delays in finalising a seat map, South Australia and Tasmania would instead treat their entire states as large multi-member electorates, with South Australia sending 7 members and Tasmania sending 5, thus bringing the total size of the first parliament up to 75. This would be the only federal election to have multi-member seats. Alongside the 75 lower house seats, 36 Senate seats would also be under congestion, with each state sending 6 senators to Parliament. This technically made the 1901 election a double dissolution election, minus the trigger. As for who could vote, while the property requirements had been abolished in all states bar Tasmania, every male over 21 was eligible to vote. This also included Aboriginal Australians in every state bar Queensland and Western Australia. However, Indigenous Australians would face a large voter suppression which prevented most from inevitably voting in this election. Despite most states allowing Aboriginals to vote, women could only vote in South and Western Australia. This resulted in calls for the soon-to-be-elected federal government to pursue a nationwide right for women to vote. As an interim Prime Minister, Barton and his protectionist party would go into the 1901 election as the preferred favourites. Formed initially in 1887 in New South Wales, the protectionists had grown in response to Australia becoming an ever more self-dependent set of colonies. As a self-dependent set of colonies, the public grew ever more concerned about importing goods from places like the United Kingdom and was to advocate for more locally produced materials. Thus, the protectionists advocated for tariffs and other import control measures to promote growth within the local Australian economy. Despite being the favourites, Barton's protectionists would be facing a strong challenge from their long-time rivals in the Free Trade Party. Also formed in 1887 New South Wales, the Free Trade Party had grown in opposition to the tariff-based policies of the protectionists. Worried about such policies limiting exports, the party had grown into prominence off the back of people dependent on foreign trade. The Free Trade Party would be led by George Reid, who had previously served as Premier of New South Wales from 1894 to 1899. While the election would predominantly be a contest between the protectionist and free trade parties, a few smaller parties would also contest the election. Of these, the most notable had to be the Labour parties. Throughout the 1890s, unions across the colonies had grown to prominence off the back of ever-increasing industrialisation and the poor working conditions that workers were facing in these industrialised sectors. These unions soon realised to get the changes they wanted would require representatives in government to advocate on their behalf, and thus the Labour parties were formed. Despite contesting the election of 1901, the Labour parties would not run under a single leader like the protectionists and free trade, and instead would contest the election as their own separate state branches. As the campaign got underway, several policies soon came to dominate the election. The first and by far the biggest was the standardisation of Australia's railway gauges. As separate colonies, the different levels of wealth inequality had seen different colonies build different gauges, with South Australia and Victoria using broad gauge, while Western Australia and Queensland had used narrow gauges. This made intercolonial train journeys impossible, with goods and commuters having to swap trains at border towns. Thus, all major parties ran on standardising Australia's railways, as well as constructing a transcontinental railway to link Perth with the rest of the country. This would later be completed in 1917, while the entire standardisation of Australia's railway gauges would be completed a few years later in 2000 and never. Alongside the railway policies, several other policies were being proposed by both protectionist and free trade parties, such as uniform suffrage and age pensions. With so much agreement between the two parties, the Free Trade Party found themselves in a difficult position to try and justify why they should be elected over the protectionists. Thus, party leader George Reid campaigned heavily on the election being a referendum on the tariff-based policies of the protectionists, as this was the only real difference between the two parties. With the two main parties agreeing on most policies, the Labour Party would use the chance to push their own policies. These policies included a desire for a national army, compulsory arbitration of industrial disputes, and the use of a national referendum to resolve government deadlocks. Despite distancing themselves from the two main parties, Labour was very much in support of what came to be known as the White Australia policy. Over the previous century, white Anglo-Australians had clashed with a large number of Chinese immigrants arriving in the country to take part in the multiple gold rushes occurring across the nation. To prevent such racial clashes occurring in the future, all parties agreed to block any immigration by non-white people into the newly formed Australia, with hopes that a mono-ethnic nation would be more stable. And although I feel like I shouldn't need to say this, I will state it anyway. I do not support this policy, and I was glad it was repealed in the 1960s. With the stage set, the campaign would officially kick off on the 17th of January 1901 as Barton attempted to officially gain the mandate to govern. However, the campaign would almost immediately need to be put on hold following the death of the 81-year-old Queen Victoria, who at 16 days is ironically the shortest serving monarch in Australian history. Following the mourning period, the campaign would once again start up. With Barton busy running the interim government, the Free Trade and Labour parties were freer to campaign and drew larger crowds to their rallies. While the incumbency would hurt them a bit in the campaign, Premier Lyon, who was running for the federal seat of Hume, would controversially make use of his government car to travel around the electorate. This would only be one of 2 cars used in the campaign, with the other being used by shipping magnate Malcolm Mukherjee, who ran as a protectionist candidate for the seat of Melbourne. With election day fast approaching, the newspapers would throw in their endorsements as well, with the Age and Sydney Bulletin supporting Barton's protectionists, while the Sydney Morning Herald, the Daily Telegraph, the Brisbane Courier, Melbourne's The Argus and the Adelaide Register would all support Reid's Free Trade Party. Meanwhile, Labor only had the support of a few small union-backed newspaper outlets like the Gympie Truth in Queensland. And the winner was... With votes coming in, Edmund Barton and his protectionists had won the most seats, with 33 out of the total 75 seats. However, they had come short of the 38 seats needed to form the majority. George Reid and his Free Trade Party had won the largest vote share with 33.21%, but had only won 25 seats. Arguably the biggest winners were the Labour parties, who had really outperformed expectations, winning 15 seats and now being in the position of kingmaker in the 1901 Parliament. Following the first meeting of Parliament on the 8th of May in 1901, the multiple Labour parties would agree to support Barton's Protectionist Party, allowing him to remain in power for the next 3 years, while George Reid's Free Trade Party would form the first Australian opposition. While the Protectionists had dominated in Victoria, winning 17 out of the 23 seats there, the party had come up short in every other state, falling behind the Free Trade Party and even the Labour Party in the case of Queensland and Western Australia. Meanwhile, despite winning the most seats in 3 states, the Free Trade Party had only outright won the state of South Australia. Meanwhile, Labour's biggest gains were in New South Wales, where they had gained 6 seats, and Queensland, where they had won almost half the seats, which is kind of ironic when you compare it to Labour's results in the Sunshine State today. With Australia as a whole committed to protectionism, Reid's Free Trade Party never really stood a chance of winning the 1901 election. Also, with Edmund Barton only being incumbent for 3 months, the Protectionists had all the benefits of incumbency with next to no drawbacks, since there hadn't been a whole 3-year term for the party to make mistakes. Despite all of Barton's advantages, the fact that the Labour and the Free Trade Party had done so well to force a minority government could not be understated. And so the decade of 3-party rule had begun, as the Protectionist, Free Trade and Labour parties all joshed each other for control of Australia. And to learn more about this decade, feel free to check out my video on the election of 1903.